In an age of wireless internet, global positioning, satellites, and computer-driven weapon systems, the concept of a working dog might be viewed as anachronistic. One would think there must be any number of high-technology devices that can do what a dog can do. However, it remains a fact that in this post-9/11 world of terrorist threats and massive narcotics trafficking, trained working dogs are perhaps the most efficient screening and detection tool that government and law enforcement have. However, the difficulty and the scope of the modern detector dog's task are so great that training methods are under great pressure to evolve. The time is at hand when innovative thinkers have the opportunity to make enormous contributions to the art and science of detector dog training. Randy Hare of Alpha Canine Training Center in Jackson, Mississippi, is one of those innovators. This veteran police dog handler and trainer is the architect of a revolutionary new method for training detector dogs. In the first video of this series, On Target Training Substance Detector Dogs with Randy Hare, Detection 1, we introduced you to the cardinal features of the Hare method and demonstrated the teaching of the first 3 training objectives in Randy's system. In this video, we continue to discuss the use of Randy's detection training boxes to develop your working dog into a highly specific and sensitive search instrument. Perhaps the most startling and remarkable aspect of Randy Hare's method of training detection dogs is the way that his dogs ignore the ball unless it has been presented in conjunction with odor. To put it in Randy's terms, the dog learns to distrust what he sees, hears, and smells other than target odor. Randy begins the process of teaching the dog to ignore and distrust ball cues encountered during a search simply by using the ball to attract the dog to the wrong box. But before the dog reaches the box, Randy withdraws the ball up into his hand. The dog normally investigates the box, and he may even scratch or bite at it. But in the absence of any further encouragement, he soon becomes discouraged and begins searching about. Randy waits patiently until the dog hits the target box and indicates target odor, and then he quickly rewards the animal with a fight. Very soon the dog will learn to distrust that initial sight of the ball. He will begin to regard the sight of the ball as a cue telling him that reward is available rather than as a promise of reward in a particular location. In the next step, Randy ups the ante further by leaving the ball in sight behind the plexiglass window even after the dog reaches the box. Quite naturally, the dog will begin to scratch and alert at the window in the effort to get the ball. Randy waits patiently for the dog to become frustrated, realize that the reward is not available, and begin investigating the other boxes. In the process, he will hit odor and earn reward. Some very drivey dogs will be so fixated by the sight and smell of the ball behind the plexiglass that they will scratch and claw and bite at the window for several minutes or more without weakening, and without realizing that reward is not available when target odor is not present. It would not be constructive to allow the dog to alert on the ball for minute after minute until he finally became exhausted and lost interest in the exercise altogether. To prevent this from occurring, Randy has 2 tricks up his sleeve. First, from time to time, while the dog is working to get to the ball, Randy pulls the ball up into his hand through the reward tube and at the same time raises the plexiglass window, allowing the dog to explore and investigate the reward chamber. After 1 or 2 repetitions of this procedure, even a very fixated and drivey dog normally realizes that the rules have changed and begins to experiment by investigating the other boxes. In the unusual case that the dog is so fixated on the ball, so active and drivey, that even after a few non-reward presentations, he still stubbornly alerts on it, Randy simply withdraws the ball from the box and waits until the dog looks elsewhere for reinforcement. Once the dog finds the target box and makes his indication, then he is promptly rewarded. After a few experiences in which he earns reward by leaving the location where he encountered balls, it will become easier for the dog to leave the ball even when it is left in sight behind the plexiglass window. With practice, the dog will eventually develop the ability to effortlessly disengage his attention from the ball he can see and smell behind the plexiglass window and keep searching for target odor. This is highly significant because it shows not only that the dog is becoming less distractible, but that he is beginning to have a deep understanding of his task. He is capable of channeling his attention away from something that would normally be highly attractive to him and instead focus on target odor. By specifically not rewarding responses to non-target cues, what Randy is doing is strengthening the stimulus control of detection behavior by target odor. He is making the dog ever more specific and ever more sensitive to target odor by teaching him very specifically that other cues are not associated with reward, even the cues associated with the ball itself. As a result, target odor, as the only reliable cue predicting reward, takes on more and more significance and control over the dog's behavior. The first time we inject a moving ball into the situation, the animal will often forget himself to some extent and again respond to the ball. Randy simply waits until the dog realizes no reward is forthcoming and begins to look elsewhere. If for some reason the dog becomes fixated on the ball and has difficulty leaving it, Randy immobilizes the ball or even withdraws it from the box and opens the plexiglass window to help the animal leave it and go back to searching for odor. In short order, the dog will ignore the sight and odor cues of balls placed behind the plexiglass windows of non-target boxes, even when they are in motion. At this point, we are ready for the next step, in which the dog learns to ignore a ball even when it is presented in the open. Randy begins this process simply by having the trainer or handler bounce a ball once against the ground where the dog can catch sight of it, while he is making his indication on the target box. The dog, of course, associates this moving ball with reward, and he breaks off his indication and whirls around to try and catch it. The handler simply holds the ball out of sight, and handler and trainer wait until the dog goes back to the target box and resumes his indication, and then he wins reward. This procedure will be repeated several times. The dog's indication of the target is disrupted less and less until finally he pays absolutely no attention to the ball unless it appears behind the plexiglass window in association with target odor.
We want the dog to understand that target odor is paramount. He has to find that in order to obtain his reward. If he doesn't, then reward doesn't come. And if we can get that across to the animal, then we have what's called obedience to odor. Anytime he goes into the odor, he raises his level of drive to an excitement level that is very easy for a handler to read. He goes to a final response of two different behaviors that he's been taught and shaped on the boxes. And then if the situation indicates, he can actually go to an oral response where he gets his mouth on the contraband itself, and then he's presented with a reward.
Randy strengthens the dog's obedience to odor in any number of ways. For instance, the trainer tempts the dog with a ball on a tether. The tether allows him to snap the ball away from the dog if the animal is momentarily tempted to try and catch it. In this way, the dog learns to ignore ball cues even when they are very intense and immediate. Once Randy has perfected the dog's obedience to odor while the animal is making his indication, the next step is to introduce the ball randomly while the dog is searching. First, the ball is simply bounced once near the dog as he searches. Any minor break in the dog's search focus is ignored, and he is allowed to go back to work and make his find. Major disruptions of focus are dealt with by dragging the dog away from the search and back to his crate while he is being stimulated with the ball. Through exercises like these, the dog will develop the ability to narrowly and powerfully focus his attention on one stimulus dimension only, smell, and one specific signal in that stimulus dimension only, target odor. At this point, we have harnessed the dog's entire capability and power as a biological detective. The last step in the process of teaching the dog to divert his attention away from a reward in order to win that reward is to introduce the ball as a command. In this context, the presentation of the ball acts as a cue signaling to the dog that it is time to search. The handler lets the dog take the ball and tug on it for a moment, and then takes the ball back and hides it in his armpit. The handler simply ignores the dog until the frustrated animal does what he has done before to win reward, goes to the rack and begins to search. If the dog is very stubborn about watching his handler, then the trainer can help things along. He attracts the dog's attention to the rack with a tethered ball in a non-target box. After a few trials like this, the dog will learn to disengage his attention from his handler after the ball is put away and begin searching. Letting the dog have the ball briefly and taking it away, or just showing the dog the ball and then securing it, becomes a command. The sight or brief possession of the ball takes on the properties of a conditioned cue with two separate functions. First, interaction with the ball prepares the dog by exciting him and bringing him into drive. It is this drive, this awakened desire for a ball fight, that fuels the dog for the search. Another way to think of it is that we must put the dog in the proper emotional state for work. This is easily done in the training room because here all the cues of the situation tell the dog clearly what he is there for. Excited, blood is flowing into muscles and fluid into joints to prepare them for vigorous action. However, when he is deployed as a working detector dog, the animal will not have clear and powerful cues telling him that a particular situation holds the promise of a ball fight. For instance, a detector dog handler may have to walk the animal a considerable distance prior to deploying him, or wait for a long period of time at a scene prior to beginning his search. Thus, the operational detector dog handler is often faced with the problem of how to trigger intense motivation, how to kick him from his resting state into drive so that he is ready to search. Handlers often try to bring their dogs into readiness for searching by giving him a verbal cue that he associates with the ball. But in Randy's opinion, the best signal to the dog that he should prepare to search for and find a target in order to earn a reward is a taste of the reward itself. As its second function, a brief interaction with the ball prior to work serves as an instrumental discriminative stimulus. It is the command that tells the dog that if he begins to search, a reward is available. As the ultimate refinement of the dog's response to target odor, Randy teaches the animal to indicate the presence of target substance by deliberately mouthing or biting the hide. Randy refers to this as the oral response. Now, let's be clear. This oral response has nothing to do with playing with the hide. At this stage in his education, the hair-trained dog is perfectly clear in his understanding that the reward exists in one place and the target of his search exists in another place. He has absolutely no desire to play with the target, but he knows that he must find the target because it is a signpost on the path to reward. Furthermore, he knows that he must interact with the target in a specific way. Thus far, the instrumental behavior that the dog used to interact with the hide in order to attain reward was the standard aggressive response, involving scratching and clawing and hopefully also head poking, mouthing, and biting. This behavior began with what Randy refers to as the original response, a limited behavior exhibited quite naturally when he encountered a ball he couldn't reach, or target odor that he learned to associate with the ball. Through repeated training trials and deliberate shaping of the detection response, Randy gradually molded the original response into a more comprehensive and diverse pattern of behavior that he calls the final response. Randy takes great pains to make sure that strong elements of head poking or biting are included in this final response, rather than just scratching. The oral response is a further elaboration and refinement of the dog's final response, putting ultimate emphasis on the dog using his mouth to interact with the hide in order to win reward. The oral response exerts three very important influences on the manner in which the dog will use his final response to indicate real-world targets. First, by giving the dog a preferred manner of indicating that requires physical contact with the target, we reduce the probability that the dog will exhibit a false response. That is to say, the scratch and bite or scratch and head poke response requires, as a substrate only, a convenient surface to scratch and mouth. A dog can execute a very convincing scratch and bite final indication on any cupboard door or in any corner. In contrast, the oral detection response requires, for a substrate, the hide itself. By making the oral detection response a part of the dog's indication, we help to ensure that the dog will never exhibit a full-blown indication unless target odor is truly present and he is unable to make physical contact with it. Second, the oral response delays the final response. For reasons that we will explain later, the hair-trained detector dog prefers to use the oral response when he can. As a result, he withholds the final response while he investigates the hide in the effort to find a way to make the oral response. A hair-trained detector dog exhausts all efforts to come into direct contact with the hide before beginning to scratch. Because the final response is delayed, the effect is to prolong the duration of what we will call the alert. The alert is the orientation response that occurs after the dog has recognized the presence of target odor, but before he sets to work indicating its location to his handler. The alert encompasses all the behavior that the dog exhibits from the moment that he realizes that target odor is present until the moment that he emits either the oral response or the final response. The duration and complexity of this alert response differs from dog to dog. In one case, the animal may emit his final response almost instantly that he recognizes that target odor is present. He alerts, showing a heightening of interest or attention, and then immediately he scratches and bites at the nearest available substrate. In the event that the source of the odor is not close nearby, then this short alert, followed by a premature final response, is a fault, called by some trainers a fringe response. Dogs trained to indicate odor passively by sitting, as explosives dogs normally do, are very prone to fringe responses. They may sit tens of feet away from the source of odor, and therefore they must receive specific training to prolong the alert and localization phase and defer the final passive response. Various strategies are used in this attempt, but they all suffer from the fact that a passive final response requires little in the way of a substrate to support it. A dog can sit anywhere in a search problem. Contrast this with the case in which the dog exhibits a very protracted and elaborate alert. He first exhibits a quickening of interest that shows his handler unmistakably that target odor may be present, and then, for a period of 5 or 10 or 15 or even 20 seconds, he investigates the odor, using the gradient of concentration to move ever closer to the source. He finally exhibits a final response only when he cannot localize any more exactly and when he discovers that he will be unable to make physical contact with the hide. This is the insight behind Randy Hare's use of the oral response. Because the oral response requires as its substrate the hide itself, the oral response prolongs and develops the alert, delaying the final response and encouraging the dog to attempt physical contact with the target prior to making his indication. Such an alert gives the handler a longer and more obvious change in behavior to notice and observe, to make sure that he does not overlook the fact that his dog is hitting on odor. Also, prolonging the duration of the alert that precedes the final response enormously facilitates localization. When the dog withholds the scratch response in the effort to find the hide and come into contact with it, the result is a prolonged and meticulous attempt to pinpoint the odor source. By prolonging the alert phase that occurs prior to the final response, the oral response also helps with a purely practical problem commonly experienced by handlers of detector dogs trained to make aggressive indications. Such dogs frequently damage property while making their indications. When the dog is taught to preferentially make the oral response, he spends 5 or 10 or more seconds alerting to the location and exploring it with his head and mouth. This gives the handler a window of opportunity to observe the alert, pinpoint the location of the hide, and intervene and prevent the dog from carrying out the full-blown aggressive indication. It is during the teaching of the oral response that we see why Randy emphasizes rewarding the dog not merely with possession of the ball, but with a fight, and that the fight should take place at the mouth of the reward tube. As a result of many training trials, the dog develops the expectation of finding a game at the mouth of the reward tube. Many of the dogs that Randy trains express this expectation dramatically by returning to the mouth of the reward tube again and again, even when they already possess the ball. This habit of gravitating towards the mouth of the reward tube provides Randy with the raw behavioral material he needs to engineer the dog into offering an oral response. For the first oral response session, Randy prepares what he calls a trap. The trap is composed of a target placed in such a way that if the dog disturbs it, it will cause a ball reward to become available. Although Randy employs a number of different types of trap, when using a scent box, the trap is devised by dropping a canvas bag or PVC tube containing target substance and attached to a bungee into the reward tube and fastening it to the top of the reward tube, effectively blocking the dog from the ball that is dropped in behind it. At this stage of training, the essential feature of the training protocol is that by offering an oral response, the dog self-rewards. The absence of any need for participation by handler or trainer removes the dog further from their influence, sharpening his attention and focus on the hide. As always, the dog is stimulated to come into drive by letting him see the ball or possess it briefly, and then the handler puts the ball away. The dog turns his attention to the boxes in the short rack and begins to search them avidly, quickly making his find. The fact that the dog's habit is to move towards the mouth of the reward tube causes him to investigate the hide with his head rather than simply begin scratching. Initially, he may scratch, as this is often part of his original response. However, in shaping the final response, the dog has learned additional solutions to the problem of obtaining reward, such as nose pokes and biting. He may bite the canvas bag, bump it with his nose repeatedly, or simply scratch. But one way or another, the dog normally disturbs the hide so that the ball falls out and he is rewarded. Once the mechanics of the situation become familiar to the dog, the hide can be moved further up the reward tube, so he has little option other than to use his mouth to produce reward. With just a few repetitions of this exercise, the dog learns to very deliberately interact with the hide by touching it, normally by biting it and quickly pulling it out of the reward tube so that the ball falls free. It is important to note that the dog does not interact with the hide any longer than it takes him to expose the ball. He is biting the hide not to derive enjoyment from interacting with it, but in the effort to produce ball reward. Now, without explaining why, we have taken it as a given that the oral response has primacy. That is, when the oral response is properly taught and manipulated, it is the dog's preferred or default response to target odor. He does not begin to scratch and claw until he has exhausted every possibility of coming into direct contact with the hide so that he can bite or mouth it. This is not because the dog naturally prefers to indicate by biting rather than by scratching. Quite the contrary. Most dogs tend to use their feet vigorously, but require extensive training to encourage them to head poke and mouth while they make their indication. The hair-trained dog withholds the final response in favor of the oral response because Randy has deliberately manipulated his expectations. That is, Randy ensures that the oral response is the dog's preferred response by manipulating the schedule of final responses versus oral responses.
Once the dog has learned what we want as far as the oral detection, we understand that we have 3 different areas of the alert. We have the distinct behavior change, we have the final response, and then we have the oral response. If the dog thinks he's got to get his mouth on the contraband, he will always work to pinpoint it. So we establish a ratio that the dog is going to do that orally 80% of the time, 20% of the time he's just going to go to final response. If we keep that ratio and adjust it to however we need, Then we'll have a dog that's very clear and concise in his behavior. He thinks he's got to go to an oral response. He'll work to pinpoint the contraband.
As a result, when he detects odor, he exhausts every possibility in attempting to make contact with the hide, in the process exhibiting the prolonged and distinctive alert behavior and the accurate localization for which Randy's dogs are notable. Now, we are ready to expand the scope of the dog's work significantly. Rather than working only on the short rack of scent boxes, the dog's search horizon will broaden to include the entire room. The room, like the short rack, is a special Randy Hare invention. It is a relatively small workspace in which 2 or 3 or even 4 walls are equipped with double rows of detection training boxes hanging on brackets so that they are replaceable and movable. The lowest boxes have their reward chambers about 7 inches from the floor, and the highest at perhaps 35 inches from the floor. As with every part of Randy's tightly integrated system, training in the box room has specific goals. First, the box room supports longer search problems, so that the dog begins developing the ability to search intensively for longer periods. Second, the box room allows the dog to encounter odor in high as well as low placements and practice his localization skills over more territory. Third, the box room provides the handler and trainer and other assistants the room and scope to play a more active role in the dog's searches, not to encourage the dog to be obedient and responsive to his handler during searching, but instead to teach the dog to be utterly independent and insensitive to the handler and other personnel while he is working. Fourth, the box room still enables the powerful behavioral control afforded by the special properties of Randy's detection training boxes. This control is what supports perhaps the most important function of work in the box room, teaching the dog to ignore a very wide range of stimuli he may encounter during searches. Randy relies only on the dog's obedience to odor to make him indicate his first hide outside of the confines of the short rack. He places a hide in a box hanging on the wall near one end of the short rack, in a position so, with little manipulation, the dog will locate it. The plexiglass door cord on each target box contains a metal ring that is able to be attached to a retractable lead. This arrangement allows the plexiglass window of any target box in any location in the box room to be opened from a distance. Thus, the trainer can reward a dog's indication by allowing him access to the reward chamber of the target box without standing anywhere near it or by approaching it. This configuration works perfectly with Randy's introduction to the wall boxes. The trainer stands behind the short rack and stimulates the dog with a tethered ball while the handler moves the dog at an angle toward the wall boxes. As the dog approaches the wall boxes, the dog's obedience to odor and the cue of the boxes creates the first opportunity for the dog to hit target odor and obtain reward. Quite normally, the dog locates target odor, the plexiglass is raised by the handler, and the dog goes to oral response and produces reward, which is coupled with fight through the tube. Progressively, the hide is placed further and further away from the short rack, and in high boxes as well as low. The handler's job is to influence the dog as little as possible while the animal works out the problem. He does not show the dog where to search or where to indicate. He does not praise the dog for working or for alerting on the hide. He only makes sure that the inexperienced dog does not spend all of his energy searching in unproductive areas of the room. He does so by using the leash to make sure that the animal moves through that part of the room where he will catch the odor and then obey it by following the odor to its source. Until now, the final response was rewarded by dropping the ball to the dog through the reward tube. In the box room, this is not a possibility because we are deliberately placing the trainer and handler at a distance from the target box. Now, for the first time, the handler will begin rewarding the dog himself by hand. He does so simply by dropping the ball in at the point where the dog is indicating and then encouraging him to play with it. Now, recall that in order to reap the benefits of teaching the dog the oral detection response, the dog must prefer the oral response. From this point forward in the dog's training, about 80% of the search problems will conclude with the dog gaining access to the hide and mouthing it in order to produce reward through a trap or other manipulated hide, allowing oral access. In about 20% of the search problems, the dog will be unable to make physical contact with the hide, and he will be rewarded for offering a final response. As training progresses, Randy gradually increases the length of time required for the dog to complete the box room problems. In addition to gradually lengthening the period of time necessary to complete the problems, Randy sets the problems so that their durations are variable and highly unpredictable. Thus, at the beginning of any particular search, the dog has no way to predict how much work will be required to secure his reward. Randy refers to this phase of training as conditioning the dog's clock.
As we condition the dog's clock, so to speak, we want to vary the amount of time it's going to take the dog in order to come across the contraband odor, follow it to the source, and indicate on it. We do that because we want the dog to learn to be methodical in his search, to know that the actual alert may come 3 or 4 minutes into the search, it may come 3 or 4 seconds into the search. And as long as he understands that it could come at any time, he'll learn to be methodical in his search and to release his energy into the actual alert as opposed to releasing his energy into the search itself.
Of course, conditioning the dog's clock means increasing the dog's endurance and persistence to prepare him for the 20 and 30-minute searches he may be called upon to perform in certification and service. But it also means adjusting the dog's expectancy and his behavior so that he invests an even amount of effort and concentration throughout the search problem, whether it is 1 minute into the problem or 10 minutes in. A veteran detector dog from Randy's program displays a consistently steady output of effort from the beginning to the end of a search. Contrast this with the pattern we often see, in which the dog starts strongly and with great excitement, normally neglecting to search carefully and hurrying too much, and then works with medium effort for a period of time and then gradually peters out as he becomes tired and discouraged. Randy avoids this trap by conditioning the dog's clock early in his career, so that just as he ignores cues emanating from the ball because they do not predict reward as well as target odor does, he also ignores time cues because he knows that there is no way to predict how long he will be required to search before making the find. Now, we are ready to discuss another of Randy Hare's major innovations to detector dog training, the method he uses to increase the dog's specificity to target odor by systematically removing the influences of a wide range of different distractions. Now, in order to have any appreciation for the power of the Hare method, it is necessary to elaborate on the term distraction, to expand this notion into several different categories of stimuli that compete with the target odor for the dog's attention. Each category competes for the dog's attention in different ways. The first category we can call simple distractors. This is what we mean when we casually talk about a dog's being distracted. A simple distraction is merely a noise or an odor or a visual stimulus that makes it difficult for the dog to concentrate on a task, or that the dog might be a little bit afraid of. The great part of the difficulty of actual detector dog operations is that they take place in constantly changing environments full of many varieties of intense stimuli perfectly calculated to disturb a dog's concentration. Depending on the specific application, a detector dog may be called upon to search next to a busy highway, or near an unruly crowd of onlookers, or in close proximity to another dog. In order to be operationally effective, the detector dog must not be disturbed, frightened, or distracted by stimuli and events in the search environment. Randy's box room with its scent box rack is the ideal setting in which to teach the detector dog to ignore simple distractions. The contextual cues of this room have been conditioned to ball fighting and searching, so that the moment the dog comes into the room, he knows what he is there for, and he comes into drive. These contextual cues and associations are therefore present to support the dog's performance and keep him preoccupied with searching and ball fighting while we progressively expose him to more and more intense distractors. Therefore, while the dog is still working in the box room, Randy brings every possible environmental distractor into the problem, carefully and progressively increasing the intensity of the distractor and hence the challenge to the dog's powers of concentration. The dog is gradually introduced to the presence of battery-driven toys, blaring radios, running vacuum cleaners, and any other stimulus or appliance that Randy can think of. Other domestic animals are a constant source of difficulty for detector dogs, so naturally Randy also makes use of crates containing cats and dogs, rabbits, and any other creature that he can lay his hands on. These stimuli are introduced at a low level of intensity first, and then ramped up. For instance, first the dog is accustomed to the presence of a vacuum cleaner in the search area, and then to the vacuum cleaner while on, closer and closer to the hide. Then he is accustomed to working while the vacuum cleaner is turned on, but kept on the other side of the room away from the search area. Finally, he is expected to search around, past, and over a running vacuum cleaner. The first time a dog encounters an intense stimulus like this while searching, it is not unusual for him to be distracted for a moment, or even to have his concentration completely disrupted. This is normal, to be expected, and even desirable, because we want to address any problems with distractibility now instead of when the dog is in actual service. How the handler and trainer respond to the dog's difficulty depends on the degree of distraction the animal suffers. Distracting odors deserve special consideration because when a searching dog encounters a strange or attractive odor, his expression of interest in the odor can somewhat resemble the changes that he exhibits when he detects traces of target odor. The hair method provides a very powerful methodology for teaching the detector dog to ignore distractor odors while searching. Randy's detection training boxes are ideal tools for the presentation of such odors, and the familiar stimuli of the training room helps to keep the dog in drive and on task while he encounters new difficulties. For instance, Randy has scent boxes that are used specifically to present the dog with types of food such as meat, tuna, and cat food. Randy even has boxes for roadkill and rotten meat, and a distractor box that he places out on the ground for other dogs to urinate on. In addition, Randy will often bang the tethered ball against the boxes to spread saliva from the many dogs that have worked the room and possessed that ball. The distractor box is placed in the box room where the dog will encounter it prior to finding the target box. If the distractor odor merely has the effect of disrupting the dog's attention momentarily, the animal is allowed to continue the search, recovering his concentration and overcoming the challenge on his own. On the other hand, if he allows the strange odor to completely distract him and stop the search, so that he obviously falls out of drive and begins to investigate the odor, then the handler takes control of him, the trainer teases him with a reward, and he is dragged out of the training room and put away in a crate for a period of time. When the frustrated dog returns, he normally pays little attention to the distracting odor. Instead, he gets on with the business of searching for the hide. Using the box room, with a relatively small investment of effort, Randy can create a young detector dog that is resistant to simple distractions of all kinds, including powerful and attractive odors. This ability to focus attention will generalize to a great extent from the box room to operational settings. Thus, the hair-trained dog has little difficulty adjusting to realistic search problems with all of the challenges and distractions they present. So far, we have discussed only simple distractors, stimuli in the search environment that are not related in any orderly way with reward. Therefore, we do not inform the dog in any manner. All they do is make it difficult for him to concentrate. Now, we begin to discuss a different type of distractor, stimuli that are informative to the dog because they exist in specific and predictable relationships with reward. This is particularly true of certain odors that are associated with the manufacture and presentation of detector dog training aids.
When we discuss concomitant odors, the danger in concomitants is where we actually isolate a particular odor with the contraband itself or with the target itself. whether it's PVC pipe, whether it's the tennis balls, whether it's the packaging materials and the plastic bags, we make sure that those are located all throughout the room so that we don't have those particular odors in isolation. The only isolation odor has to be the contraband itself or the target itself.
When we reward a detector dog for scratching and biting at the source of an odor produced by a drug training aid, most of us assume that we are rewarding the dog for responding to the odor of the drug itself. We tend to forget that it is virtually impossible to present a drug odor in isolation from other odors that are associated with the manufacture, handling, and placement of training aids. For instance, powdery substances like cocaine must be contained inside some sort of package, so that particles are not lost and allowed to contaminate the area. Because Randy always prefers to use real target substances as opposed to synthetics, dangerous substances like heroin must be presented in a safe and responsible manner. These needs are normally addressed by using some sort of standardized container. Canvas bags, PVC plastic tubes, metal tins, and plastic containers are all made and sold for the purpose of containing detector dog training aids. The problem is that all of these materials generate their own odors. As a result, when we present the dog with a ball after he samples the vapor coming from a drug training aid, we may be forming an association in the dog's mind between reward and the odors of canvas, plastic, or metal. In addition, because the detector dog is normally trained by one or a very few individuals, this means that training aids produce not only target odor and the odor of packaging materials, they are also marked by the odor of one or more individuals with whom the dog is likely to be familiar. Thus, a reward for indicating a training aid can also be a reward for indicating a distinctive human odor. Of course, trainers often attempt to prevent human contamination of training aids by using plastic or rubber gloves, but because these gloves have their own, often powerful smell, they too can easily contaminate training aids. Therefore, because concomitant odors are inevitably associated with the manufacture, preparation, and placement of canine detector training aids, minimizing their effects and influence is one of the fundamental problems in detector dog training. Randy Hare calls this process neutralizing concomitant odors, and he employs two basic strategies to do so. The first strategy is common to much of the detector dog training community and simply consists of using as many different packaging materials as possible. For instance, Randy uses canvas, PVC, and metal to package contraband and present it to detector dogs. When multiple materials are used for packaging, the effect is to reduce the predictive value of any individual packaging odor. That is, if PVC tubing is used to package the contraband 1/3 of the time, then 2/3 of the time the dog will experience reward when no PVC is present. This means that PVC exists in an imperfect relationship to reward. In contrast, target odor exists in perfect relationship to reward. The dog will never receive the ball unless target odor is present. Countless laboratory studies have shown that animals tend to ignore less perfect predictors of reward and instead attach most of their learning to more reliable predictors. This well-established psychological principle is called associative blocking. As a result of blocking, the dog pays little attention to the odor of PVC tubing and learns to associate reward with target odor. However, in spite of the useful effects of blocking, when we use multiple packaging materials, it is not unusual for a dog to make some association between concomitant odors and reward, despite our best efforts to prevent it. This learning about concomitants may become a problem, especially in advanced stages of training and deployment, when the search times become longer and the range of different odors encountered become greater. This consideration makes it necessary to employ another strategy to reduce the control of the dog's behavior by concomitant distractors. Randy Hare's box room provides us with a very powerful method for extinguishing any control that concomitant odors may have picked up in the course of basic training. If the dog was trained in the short rack to detect cocaine contained in an aluminum training tin, Randy will introduce distractor scent boxes that contain aluminum training tins. Now, it is important to remember that in the hare method, the dog must educate himself independently. If the animal exhibits some interest or even a full alert when encountering scent boxes containing aluminum tins or PVC tubing or other concomitant materials, the handler and trainer must resist the temptation to intervene. They simply ignore the dog until he realizes, as he normally will in short order, that no reward is associated with the concomitant odor in isolation from target odor. The dog will begin casting about, then encounter the target box and make his indication and receive reward. This procedure, in which a response to the concomitant odor is ignored, while responding to concomitant plus target is reinforced, is perfectly calculated to teach the dog to ignore the concomitant. As always, he solves the problem on his own and becomes ever more self-reliant.
In discussing concomitant odors, if we have a dog that actually alerts on a box containing concomitants, we'll actually open that box and let him explore and realize that there is no reward available, if that in fact is what's happening. Once he observes that and understands that, he'll move on and learn that the only reliable source to the reward is the target odor.
Upon hitting a concomitant that attracts his attention, he refuses to be fixated by it, casts about, discovers the target box, makes his indication, and achieves reward. Within just a few trials, providing he is left alone to learn the lesson independently, the dog will lose his responsiveness to concomitants and show more and more specific responding to target substance. In addition to neutralizing the odors of packaging materials, Randy also uses his scent boxes to prepare the dog for concomitants he will encounter in real-world searches. These materials include duct tape, plastic bags, air freshener, and other materials that traffickers use for packaging or in the attempt to mask contraband odor. They are concomitants in the sense that they will be reliably associated with contraband odor once the dog begins discovering real-world detector dog targets. By accustoming the dog to such concomitant odors prior to having the animal encounter them in association with target odor, Randy is making use of another psychological effect called latent inhibition. In latent inhibition, once a dog has learned that a particular stimulus is irrelevant or uninformative, once he has learned to ignore it, he will subsequently have great difficulty forming an association between that stimulus and rewards. Therefore, any responding or interest on the dog's part towards these distractor boxes is handled just as before. The dog is allowed to work himself through minor disruptions to his search performance. However, major disruptions are met by terminating the problem, stimulating the dog with a ball, and dragging him out of the box room. The dog will quickly learn that the odors of these concomitant substances should be ignored. This means that subsequently, as an operational detector dog, even though the animal may encounter a material again and again in association with target odor, the rewards he receives will tend only to reinforce the association in his mind between target odor and the ball. The astute viewer will have realized by now that to the extent that the handler changes his behavior when he knows his dog is near a hide, then handler behavior is another type of concomitant stimulus that is associated reliably with reward. Again, Randy Hare's box room provides us with an ideal platform to desensitize the dog to handler cues in the early stages of his career. Once the dog is reasonably proficient in the box room, ranges freely throughout the room, and is adept at localizing and indicating an aid anywhere in the space, then the handler and the trainer become more active while the dog is searching. They begin dropping the leash or letting the dog off leash and moving around while the dog searches. The handler talks to the dog more, tapping a scent box with his hand every now and again. Now, the point here is not that the handler is teaching the dog to follow handler direction or be obedient in any way. Quite the contrary. What the handler is doing is making his presence felt more and more during the search, but in a way that does not help the dog attain reward. The dog may be slightly distracted at first, but after a few searches, the animal should quickly begin ignoring the handler. At this point, the handler begins making deliberate attempts to influence the animal, to distract him. to convince him that a particular box must be the target box. He repeatedly calls the dog's attention to a certain box, begins praising him excitedly when he sniffs the box. Of course, he is lying to the dog. The box he indicates is a blank box, and the target box is located elsewhere. If the dog takes the hint and examines a box more closely, or even begins an indication on the box, he will soon realize that he has been deceived and no reward is forthcoming. The net effect is to render the handler's behavior absolutely uninformative, to make it clear to the dog that there is no relationship between what his handler does and reward. The dog does with this information what he does with all stimuli that are uninformative and unrelated to reward. He tunes handler cues out and ignores them. If the dog literally ignores the handler, then the handler does not need to be so perfectly discreet in his movements when the dog team comes near to the side of a hide. Again, the astute viewer will have realized that this is another example in which Randy uses the latent inhibition effect to reduce the dog's ability to learn about certain critical stimuli. To put it in psychological terms, by habituating the dog to handler cues, by teaching him that they are meaningless, Randy blocks any later learning about these cues. The importance of desensitizing the dog to his handler's behavior and teaching him that it is not a helpful source of information is in direct proportion to the ability of the handler. For this reason, when Randy is training dogs that will later be paired with student detector dog handlers, Randy lays great emphasis on this phase of the dog's training. Once the job is done, and the dog searches the box room not only independently, but also without being disturbed by attempts to distract him and influence him, then the dog's basic training is almost complete. There remains only one more task to accomplish before leaving the box room. One more type of stimulus that has developed the ability to control the dog's behavior and compete with target odor for his attention. As a result of dozens of finds in the odor compartment of scent boxes, the dog naturally is attentive to the boxes and well prepared to detect target odor as long as it is presented in a scent box. On the other hand, as Randy is quick to point out, the dog is poorly prepared to localize and indicate a target that is hidden in the corner of the room. To the extent that this is true, the dog's detection behavior is not completely specific to target odor, and this is not a state of affairs with which Randy is content. Before he removes the student detector dog from the controlled laboratory of the box room, Randy removes this last remaining competitor for control of the dog's attention and behavior.
Once we've completed our conditioning of the oral bridge, which teaches the dog that he's got to go to the oral response in order to obtain his reward, we use that technique in order to move the hides away from the boxes. And when it comes time to use the boxes as a distraction themselves, we'll actually hang the contraband between the boxes. The dog has to trust his nose that it's not in a box, follow it to the source, indicate on it, and then obtain his reward. And we call that a trap. The importance of the dog being conditioned to traps and understanding that the contraband or the target may not be in the boxes is because that's what we're going to use when we go out into the world. We're going to use the actual oral detection in order to show him that that is a reliable source to reward.
For the dog's initial introduction to the trap, Randy arranges the hide and ball in a gap between two scent boxes or in a corner in such a way that the dog can reach the hide, but only by mouthing or shifting the hide can he expose the ball. The dog is allowed to search until he alerts on the odor, and then, as always, the handler stands back and gives the dog the chance to learn. From his prior conditioning, the animal will be somewhat convinced that the target must be hidden in one of the nearby scent boxes. He will tend to investigate them repeatedly and even try a half-hearted indication. However, if we have conditioned the dog correctly to obey odor and to delay his final response until he has pinpointed the hide and made sure that he cannot make the oral response, then he will eventually work his way through the problem and self-reward. Within just 2 or 3 trials, the dog's fixation on scent boxes will begin to weaken. He will begin to realize that a hide can be anywhere, and he will begin following odor blindly to source, wherever it leads him. From this point on, during any further work in the box room, about 50% of the dog's searches will involve hides in scent boxes, and 50% will involve hides in between the scent boxes or in furniture or walls or corners away from the scent boxes.
On occasion, you'll see us prepare a dog or set up a situation for a dog where he actually has to tear through something in order to obtain the source. We only do that as much as we have to in order to get it across to the dog that he's supposed to do whatever it takes in order to get to the contraband itself and interact with it in order to obtain his reward. We don't want to make it a habit of doing that too much and get the dog in the habit of actually tearing through something. On occasion, we do it on a ratio of maybe 90 to 10. He has to tear through something on the 10% as opposed to the 90%.
This concludes our discussion of the basic education of the substance detector dog using Randy Hare's method. In this video, and the first in this series, we described theory and methods for attaining a number of critically important training objectives. We used Randy's test to identify a dog with good environmental behavior and vigorous drive to struggle for possession of a ball reward. The best detector dog prospects also exhibit vigorous game, which Randy defines as a preoccupation with contest and struggle, with fighting for the ball rather than merely possessing it. Powerful game makes the dog willing to drop one ball to pursue another, and it is a foundation of a number of behaviors that will be indispensable to the dog's training. Specifically, the dog with game learns easily to continue indicating or searching when distracted by balls because he knows the fight only comes in association with target odor. In addition, he tends to gravitate to the mouth of the reward tube, even with a ball in his mouth, hoping for the ball fight that he finds there. This tendency to return persistently to the mouth of the reward tube is the basic building block for the oral detection response. We then used a short rack of Randy's detection training boxes to conduct Pavlovian conditioning trials. In the course of these trials, the dog was manipulated into investigating the scent box and noticing odor, and then he was presented with reward in the form of a ball fight at the mouth of the reward tube. Handler and trainer participated very little in the dog's learning, merely constructing the situation and introducing the ball at the right moment to form an association in the dog's mind between target odor and the ball. After a few trials and a day or two of training, the dog was encouraged to search through the short rack to find the target box, and he was required to find the odor even when it was presented in a target box with the plexiglass window closed. We then used the scent box to shape the dog's final response using his original response tendency as the raw material. In an instrumental conditioning procedure, the dog was specifically rewarded for a vigorous pattern of behavior that included scratching and clawing and also head poking or biting at the source of odor. In the next phase of basic training using the short rack, we increase the dog's specific understanding of his task by showing him that his job is not to search for the ball. He must instead search for a target odor that is a totem or signpost on the way to the ball. This objective was accomplished by exploiting the dog's game, his preference for a contest or struggle rather than merely possession of a ball. We first taught the dog to bypass a scent box in which he had seen a ball, then bypass boxes in which he could see balls in view behind the plexiglass window, and finally, we taught the dog to ignore any ball that is presented in any situation other than an association with target odor, no matter how active or tempting. We taught the dog that the only ball that presents the opportunity to fight and struggle is the ball that comes in conjunction with target odor. Once the dog was able to divert his attention from the ball cues to the search for target odor, then we conditioned him to interpret brief interaction with the ball as a search cue. This search cue functioned both to bring him into emotional and physiological readiness for searching by putting him in drive, and also served as an instrumental command telling him to begin searching. We then used Randy's detection training boxes to teach the dog to self-reward by mouthing or biting the hide. The dog also learned to prefer this oral detection response. Because the dog preferred the oral response, he exhausted every possibility for coming into physical contact with the hide, in the process delaying his final response and prolonging the alert and localization phase of detection. This oral response preference was established and maintained by putting the dog on a schedule in which his search problems concluded with the oral response and leading to reward about 80% of the time. Once the dog mastered the oral response, then he was given the freedom to obey odor and leave the confines of the short rack, learning to search for longer periods of time and localizing across the greater distances of the box room. We used variable and unpredictable durations of search to condition his clock so that he learned to search with consistent intensity from the beginning to the end of a search, whether the problem required 15 seconds or 3 minutes to complete. Then we began the important work of reducing the influence of distractors. These distractors ranged from simple distractors that were merely intense stimuli that made it more difficult for the dog to concentrate on his task, to concomitant stimuli that exist in a consistent relationship with reward. These concomitants included odors associated with the packaging and presentation of hides, handler cues, packaging and masking agents the dog is likely to encounter on active service, and even the visual and odor cues of Randy's detection training boxes themselves. This phase of training made use of psychological mechanisms like latent inhibition and blocking to ensure that the dog's detection behavior is under control of target odor, but not under the control of the other potentially informative cues available to the animal in substance detection scenarios. Throughout these videos, we have presented the training objectives and methods as if they are highly compartmentalized and hierarchical. From the standpoint of helping the student to understand the theoretical basis of the HARE method, this is a necessary feature of the presentation. However, the viewer should be aware that this presentation is to an extent artificial and misleading. In actual training, Randy is highly flexible, and he gears his instruction to the dog's individual capabilities, tendencies, and progress. He fluidly mixes together procedures and techniques directed toward the attainment of different training objectives, exploiting any opportunity to add learning value to each trial. For example, during the first 2 or 3 training sessions, when the emphasis is still upon making the odor-reward association, if Randy finds that the dog is a highly active individual that immediately begins to stab with his forefeet at the source of odor, then he may withhold the ball for a moment and begin shaping the final response from his original response. He may also add components of objectives 5, 6, and 8 by encouraging the dog to return to the short rack with a ball in his mouth to sniff the target box and beg for a ball fight, and by placing distracting odors in the other boxes of the short rack during the dog's searches. As the student has the opportunity to work with and use the method, and especially if he has the opportunity to train under Randy's direct supervision, he will develop an appreciation and an instinct for the ideal moment to introduce the dog to lessons contributing to multiple objectives. In the next video of this series, we will show how Randy efficiently teaches the dog to detect additional target odors. We will discuss methods for using Randy's method to build a dog that indicates targets with a passive rather than an active response. We will demonstrate how to strengthen the oral response by using a procedure Randy calls the oral game, and how to teach the dog to take commands and search instructions from his handler. Most importantly, we will show how to take the clear and powerful understanding of the detection task that the dog has learned in the box room and apply it to the challenges of searches in real-world environments.
Canine Training Systems is the trendsetter in canine performance video and brings you the most up-to-date techniques in training and breed-related videos, books, and training aids. Please visit our website at www.caninetrainingsystems.com.